All right. You had a situation where 1980 election was coming up and Carter was struggling big time, and they were talking about ABC. That was anyone but Carter. And the guy who was an up and comer, and fondly people remember JFK. It was his brother, Edward. They knew him as Ted Kennedy. However, once again, to the forefront came a horrible story about what happened to Kennedy in 1969. Kennedy was in an automobile accident on Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts, in which a young woman assistant was drowned when his car plunged off the bridge. It says here, on July 18th, 1969, after a party on Chappaquiddick Island near the island of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, Kennedy, allegedly intoxicated, a claim in which he denies, drove away with Mary Jo Kopechne as a passenger in his 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88. According to Kennedy, he made a wrong turn onto an unlit road that led to a bridge, which was a wooden bridge that was angled obliquely to the road, and drove over its side, which had no guardrail. The car plunged into the tide-swept Poncha Pond and landed upside down underwater. Kopechne died, but as no autopsy was performed, precise cause of death was unknown. So he actually swam away, didn't try to help her. The Kennedy family may or may not have covered it up. And, that always hurt him, obviously, and it's going to hurt him when it comes to running for president, which he was not able to do in 1980. The time was ripe for the rise of the conservatives, much like you're seeing, now with the Trump and the very similar to Trump. I wouldn't say that Reagan was going to be similar to Trump, but the movements are similar. They called it the New Right at the time, a movement in response to the counterculture movement of the 1960s, the ultra liberal counterculture movement. So the conservatives were criticizing the liberals, shocking, and that's what you see all the time, and vice versa. The liberals are criticizing the conservatives, so it goes back and forth. It was led by a religious group called the Moral Majority. They denounced abortion, pornography, homosexuality, feminism, and affirmative action. So they were really, really conservative. They championed prayer in schools and tougher penalties for criminals. A Supreme Court ruling said that in the Milliken versus Bradley, said that desegregation plans could not require students to move across school district lines, so that you couldn't bus, say, white kids to the inner city, or even African-American kids from the inner city to the suburban schools. So it was a strike against integration of schools, and it really reinforced white flight during this time. So again, conservatives. Another example of conservative ruling was the Bakke case. I mentioned it in the last chapter. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that the UC Davis affirmative action plan was unconstitutional. It found that Alan Bakke had been excluded because of race and for no other reason. The immediate effect of the decision was that Alan Bakke was admitted to the medical school at UC Davis. He went on to get his medical degree, and he is currently a doctor in the Sacramento area. The court ruled that colleges and universities may take race and ethnicity into consideration as one of a number of factors when offering admission. The key point was that prospective students or employees could not be denied entrance or employment only on the account of race. And it still prevails today. They can take ethnicity, race and ethnicity into consideration, but they have to also factor in other things. So this was effectively an end to a quota system under the affirmative action. If you remember, it was a conservative president, Nixon, with his Philadelphia plan that created affirmative action, and the Bakke case essentially eliminated it. So a victory for conservatives here. Speaking of conservatives, there was Ronald Reagan. Both Reagan and FDR, in their own way, championed the common man. FDR said that big business was the foe, whereas Reagan depicted big government as the foe, saying that government in your face all the time, providing jobs like they did in the New Deal, was just not right. They hated the fact that the Democrats would want to tax, and then spend all that money and redistribute it to people, giving them jobs and whatnot. Reagan did not like big government. FDR supported big government, right? The whole alphabet soup organizations. He condemned federal intervention in local affairs and favoritism for minorities in affirmative action. He was a neoconservative, meaning really conservative. He championed free market capitalism, or neo being new conservative. Free market capitalism, liberated from any kind of government restraints, very Republican, very 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. And he also took a strong anti-Soviet position in foreign policy. Right, he was going to stand up to them. He came out with guns blazing. Family values became also a big issue within the Republican Party. They were strong for and support of family values. Ronald Reagan was an actor, a well-known actor. Here he is in a number of different roles here. He was also an athlete. He played football in college. He also played George Gipp from the Warner Brothers film Knute Rockne, All-American in 1940. Win one for the Gipper was a famous quote that came out of that movie. And he was also, as well as being a football player, he's also a very good diver, swimming and diving. He was the former governor of California from 1967 to 1975. In the election of 1980, he destroys Jimmy Carter. Inflation, high interest rates, and faltering economy really hurt Carter. And on the day of Reagan's inauguration, the day he was sworn in, after 444 days in captivity, the 52 hostages that were taken in Iran were released. And it looked like this Reagan was a Superman. Like man, he is a badass. Sorry, but that's what it seemed like in 1981 when he became president, because from the time he became president, it's like, whoa, man, he got that done quickly. Carter was trying to get it done, but could never do it. And one day in office, and Reagan gets it done. Reagan's goals: reduce the size of government by shrinking the federal budget and slashing taxes. It's going to become known as Reaganomics. So reduce the size of government by shrinking the federal budget, not spending as much, and slashing people's taxes. Cut taxes, put money in the hands of people. Right? It's really, what's called supply side economics. Put money in the hands of people and they will demand a supply of goods. Right? It's not necessarily the 1920s trickle down effect where you cut the taxes of the rich so the rich will open up factories and hire people and the money will trickle down. It's different than that. Reaganomics is supply side economics. Put money in people's hands by lowering their taxes and they will demand a supply of goods. His quote is that government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. He said the New Deal tax and spend programs hurt the economy. It went from New Deal to Fair Deal to New Frontier to Great Society, and it was tax and spend. And big government, according to Reagan, is the problem. He wants to get rid of the New Deal. He's really the first president to come out and say, we're just going to blow it up. Nixon didn't do it. I mean, a lot of things he did were very liberal. Somebody shot Reagan. In attempt to impress the actress Jodie Foster, John Hinckley shot Reagan outside the Washington Hilton. White House staff, Secret Service agents, and police officers were all around Reagan, but he still sustained a bullet wound under the left arm. Reagan was seriously wounded, but survived the attack. He went into surgery to remove the bullet. You could see here on the bottom picture, this is James Brady. If you've ever heard of the Brady Bill for gun control, it's named after him. He survived a gunshot to the head. This is White House Press Secretary James Brady lies wounded on the sidewalk outside a Washington hotel after being shot during an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981. One of his Secret Service agents, this guy right here, took a bullet for the president, dove in front of him as Hinckley was shooting and took a bullet in the stomach for the president. So he recovered from that. And here's some other things about what he wanted to do economically in Reaganomics. Reagan sought to dismantle the welfare state and the reversal of the political evolution of the preceding half century. Deep cuts amounting to 25% across the board, reductions over a period of 3 years. He wanted to lower individual tax rates, virtually eliminating federal estate taxes, and created a new tax-free savings plan for small investors called 401ks. And here's Reagan on the cover of Time magazine. The cover reads, Reaganomics, making it work. It says here, the combination of budgetary discipline and tax reduction would stimulate new investment, boost productivity, and foster dramatic economic growth. It led to the emergence of the yuppies, or young urban professionals. And remember, a lot of these were the baby boom generation. But a lot of the improvement in the economy during the Reagan years was due to massive military spending, building up our nuclear arsenal so we could smash the Soviet Union, basically what he was planning for. Speaking of massive military expenditures, Reagan cascaded nearly $2 trillion budget dollars into the Pentagon in the 1980s. He felt the need to keep up with the Soviets. And it was MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. They would get ahead of us. We'd build our military up, or build our bomb production, and then they would do the same thing, and it would go back and forth. Plunge the government into deficit spending that made the New Deal look small. Now you spend so much money. Reagan in the Cold War, Reagan called the USSR the focus of evil in the modern world. He wasn't afraid to come out and publicly say that. By enormously expanding the US military capabilities, he could threaten the USSR with a fantastically expensive new round of the arms race. The American economy could better bear the new financial burden than the Soviets. The USSR was really like the Jenga game, right? At the very end where it looked like it was going to topple, and Reagan could see it. So Reagan forced the issue. He went full in and started talking about something called Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative, that we would have a virtual dome over the United States with, basically with the use of these protective, what's the word I'm looking for? Lasers that would totally surround the United States. Then the United States would become impenetrable to nuclear bombs. Could we have done that? Probably not. If we could have, it would have cost way too much money. But he said we had the ability to be able to do it and that we were working on it. So what do the Soviets do? They are working on something similar to our Star Wars defense initiative. And they couldn't handle it. The Jenga game's going to end. Their economy is going to come crashing down when ours was better able to handle it. And we'll talk about how that happens at the end. But there were problems in the Middle East. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 to destroy our guerrilla bases. And then Reagan sent US forces as part of an international peacekeeping force to help out there. When a suicide bomber crashed a bomb-filled truck into US Army barracks in October of 1983, killing over 200 Marines, Reagan said, all right, you must not want us there. And he pulled the troops out. He wasn't messing around. He said, we're there to help you. And if you don't want our help, we're out. They left. In the election of 1984, Ronald Reagan defeats Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale was the vice president under Carter, so people were still reeling from the Carter years, and they had a bad memory of the economy at that time. So because of Walter Mondale's association with Carter, Walter Mondale loses this election in a historic fashion. He gets destroyed. Interestingly enough, he chose a vice president, a first ever woman vice president, in Geraldine Ferraro, but they lost. Walter Mondale recently died, I think a couple weeks ago. And there's Geraldine Ferraro and Walter Mondale. Gorbachev and Reagan, believe it or not, they struck up a friendship and they got along. A lot of the reason they got along is because things were going really bad in the Soviet Union and Gorbachev knew it. Two words became well known during this time. Glasnost and perestroika, and they're both Soviet, they're both Russian words. Glasnost is openness, aimed to ventilate the secretive, repressive stuffiness of the Soviet society by introducing free speech and a measure of political liberty. So everybody was talking about glasnost, hey, we're going to be open now. And then perestroika, or restructuring, was intended to revive the moribund or awful Soviet economy by adopting many of the free market practices of the capitalist West. So Gorbachev and Reagan were talking about glasnost and perestroika. They signed an agreement to cut down the number of weapons instead of continuing to escalate weapon production. They decided to ban intermediate range nuclear forces. And then a weird deal happened where Reagan got himself in trouble for helping out the Nicaraguan, well, down in the El Salvador, the Contras, aid to the Contras. We oftentimes helped evil regimes because they said that they were fighting communists. And anybody who was fighting communists at the time, we were willing to throw a bunch of money and weapons at. And this is what happened here. Reagan accused Nicaraguan Sandinistas, a group of leftists that had taken over the Nicaraguan government, of turning the country into a forward base from which communist forces could invade and conquer all of Latin America. So Reagan wanted to send aid to the Contras. He sent military advisors to prop up the pro-American government in El Salvador and sent aid to the Contra rebels who were opposing the Sandinistas. Senior administration officials secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, which was the subject of arms embargo. Well, the reason they did this is because Congress said, no, we're not going to give money to the Contras. So Reagan said, all right, I'll do it on my own. So he did that. And he sent, he facilitated the senior administration officials who were told by Reagan to do this, facilitated the sale of arms to Iran. Now, why Iran? Well, here's why. They hoped that to fund the Contras in Nicaragua while at the same time negotiating the release of several US hostages that were still in Iran. So, hey, we'll give you these weapons and we'll give you money and weapons. You give us the hostages back, and then you agree to send those weapons to the Contras so they could fight the Sandinistas, going behind everybody's back. It says in November 1986, it was revealed that a year before, American diplomats had secretly arranged arms sales to Iranian diplomats in return for the release of American hostages, and had used that money to aid Nicaraguan Contra rebels. This brazenly violated the congressional ban on helping Nicaraguan rebels, not to mention Reagan's personal vow not to negotiate with terrorists, because a lot of the Contras were terrorists. And it's in this political cartoon, it says, so he tortures, rapes, and murders. Nobody's perfect, right? This would be a Contra, you know, but he's fighting the communists. So we were willing to give him money and weapons because they were said that they were fighting the Sandinistas who were communist. The effects of this scandal, it was on TV all the time. It made Reagan look really bad. An investigation concluded that even if Reagan had no knowledge of such events as he claimed, he should have. And this scandal not only cast a dark cloud over Reagan's foreign policy success, but also brought out a picture of Reagan as a senile old man who slept through important cabinet meetings. Criminal indictments were later brought against several individuals like Oliver North, John Poindexter, and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. It made Reagan look bad. And it's never okay for a leader to say, I didn't know about it. If you didn't know about it, you should have known about it. Oliver North was one of the guys that kind of took one for the president. North became famous due to his participation in the Iran-Contra affair, in which he was the chief coordinator of the illegal sale of weapons via intermediaries to Iran, with the profits being channeled to the Contras in Nicaragua. He was responsible for the establishment of a covert network used for the purpose of aiding the Contras. And anyways, he ended up getting in trouble, but now he's a reporter on Fox. Let's talk about Reagan's economic legacy. The combination of tax reduction and huge increases in military spending opened a vast revenue hole of $200 billion in annual deficits. So the deficit continues to climb even to this day. In his 8 years in office, Reagan added nearly $2 trillion to the national debt. He contained the welfare state, officially ended the New Deal and Great Society. And another trend of Reaganomics was the widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, as it seems to always But at the end of the day, the 80s were pretty lucrative. People made money, and Reagan to this day remains a very popular president. The courts became Reagan's principal instrument. By the time he had left office, he had appointed a near majority of the judges, including the first woman judge in 1981. That was Sandra Day O'Connor. The stock market crashed in Black Monday, October 19th, 1987. 508 points in one day, huge. So there was a panic, but people stayed in. It wasn't like 1929 where everybody bailed out. Now we have some experience with it, even though it crashed in 1987, it eventually came back. The election of 1988, George H.W. Bush, handpicked successor by Reagan. Reagan was done. He'd gone 2 terms, and he said, hey, you want things to go the way they were with me? Pick George Bush. And there you have George Bush, who was a Yale graduate, former director of the CIA, and he promised a kinder and gentler America. Things like China's Tiananmen Square incident, where the Chinese students were demonstrating against the oppressive communist government, and the well-known scene of the student in front of the tank. It seemed the season for democracy had arrived. Hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy demonstrators gathered in Tiananmen Square in 1989 to protest the harsh communist government. And the Chinese government crushed the rebellion, and the world saw it on TV. There was a solidarity movement in Poland. Lech Walesa, right here, helped topple the communist regime in Poland. After that, communism quickly disappeared in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. Things were happening quickly in the 80s when it comes to elimination of communism. And it was making us look good as a country. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, one by one, these communist countries were falling. And in East Germany, you had the wall coming down in 1989, and it was amazing. You have all these people that are pounding on the wall, knocking it down, and you have the military on the other side, the East German military, just letting it happen. This is incredible. This is West Germany, West Berlin here, and here's East Berlin, and here's the Berlin Wall. Bruce Springsteen set up his stage so that it went directly to East Berlin, so they could hear everything that was going on. And they played long and loud, and all these people were here. It was a huge celebration. Bush was calling it a new world order after the demise of communism. Presidents Mikhail Gorbachev and Bush used the term to try to define the nature of the post-Cold War era and the spirit of the great power cooperation that they hoped might materialize. Gorbachev's initial formulation was wide-ranging and idealistic, but his ability to press for it was severely limited by the internal crisis of the Soviet system, meaning basically they struggled. Communism had fallen in Russia, and they were trying to institute a democratic, capitalist type economy and government, and they struggled in the beginning. Eventually they'd get better, but it was hard in the 80s. On December 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The USSR dissolved into component parts of 15 republics loosely confederated into the Commonwealth of Independent States, repudiated communism, and embraced democratic free market communism. They started, the saying was USSR, and it's no USS were. They were the USS anyway. There was a Persian Gulf War too. It was August 2nd, 1990. Saddam Hussein of Iraq sent armies to overrun Kuwait. Oil fueled Saddam's aggression. He needed money long after the war with Iran, and wanted to crush Israel. And here's this quote: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The U.S. helped supply Iraq with weapons to defeat Iran." And then now the problem is, U.S. was fighting Saddam. Saddam attacked Kuwait, and the UN Security Council unanimously condemned the invasion and demanded the immediate unconditional withdrawal of the troops. The Operation Desert Storm, 539,000 troops, 270,000 troops from 28 other countries were involved. Iraq refused to withdraw, So the Americans went in, and it was a massive and violent attack. On their way out of Kuwait, the Iraqis opened up the oil wells that burned for a really long time. It was 4 days, 100 hours, destroyed Iraq's defense, but wreaked havoc on the environment with all the oil that was burning there. Justice Clarence Thomas was the first African-American, or not second African-American justice. Bush nominated him. The NAACP opposed Thomas, even though he's African-American, because he was against affirmative action. There was a big time investigation, and they found out that he sexually harassed Anita Hill, who was a law professor at the time, but eventually he was confirmed by the Senate. That's the end of chapter 39.